The notes tell me that you want to ask about whether social construction relates to if religion is true.
Well, I'd kind of like to know whether or not you think social constructions. Oh shoot! No,
when you say that, do you mean like there's a lot of things that are social constructs? Like, do you mean religion itself?
I believe that there's actually nothing about me that's true, but I'm a physical body with a mind.
What? Okay, so now I have to ask about what you mean by true, because
then you said something that sounded like that was true.
Yeah. By true, do you mean something other than that exists?
Say that again.
So you said you believe that there's nothing about you that's true, and then you went on to say that you are a body with, I think you said mind rather than brain.
Right.
Like, you being a body sounds like something that I wouldn't use the word true, because I think it's misused more often than it's used in these contexts. But that sounds like something that exists. What do you mean when you say that there's nothing about you that's true?
Well, if I were to describe myself as to what's true, if I were to give characteristics about myself, that I'm married, that I'm an American, that I live in a certain place in a town with a name, in a country that has borders.
Do you mean, Angus, that those are things that are socially constructed, right? So the concept of a country, isn't a naturally occurring phenomenon.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wouldn't say that doesn't exist. I would say it exists as a social construct.
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, I think there are other things about you that aren't social constructs. You know, okay, you are a human. Yes, that's a label, and of course, depending on what language, it's going to be different. But what we mean, the concept that we're pointing to by putting the label human on this, that is still at least real in some sense. I mean, it may be difficult to draw a line between us and ancestors on geological time, but
how is that real? You say a language, that's a construction.
Yeah, but you're confusing the label. You're confusing the map for the place. The language, whether it's English or we make up a whole new word, points to a concept. And if that concept is something that exists in reality, like I can have a concept of a unicorn, but the unicorn doesn't exist in reality. But I can have a concept of this bottle of Coca-Cola Zero, and it exists in reality. Okay, so I mean, if we talk about the fact that what we call this drink is, but that's separate from what it is.
Yeah.
Right.
So you're using the word real. Are you using the word real in a different way than you would use the word exists? So for example, if you're saying that Coke Zero isn't real, would you say that it doesn't exist, or is it?
I'm not saying that Coke Zero or One or whatever doesn't exist.
Are you saying, for example, finish. Sorry.
There's plenty of other people who would call it something else.
Sure.
It's arbitrary.
But what they call it is independent from what it is. Yeah. And if we both agree, you know, like for example, Jamie and I each have a microphone in front of our faces. It doesn't matter what we call it. The thing that we're pointing to, no matter what language we use to describe it, is what it is, and we are both recognizing that we apparently share a reality where this thing is what it is.
Well, that's a two-part question. Because if I personally myself move the supernatural, if I define the supernatural as a product of a human mind, that it's always a product of a human mind.
When you say that, do you mean that supernatural phenomenon are, for example, illusions or delusions?
There's a problem here. You're not defining supernatural.
Yeah, you're defining a thing and using
you're providing an explanation for the source of supernatural, but you haven't said what supernatural is.
Well, I think a lot of the times we make the mistake of looking at what the subject of a claim is instead of looking at the character of the claim.
Can you specify what you mean as the character of the claim and how it would be different than the subject?
Well, the character of a claim would be that somebody claims a thing, but they have no evidence whatsoever that the only way that claim exists is if there's someone who claims it. There's a claimant.
Okay. I don't understand how this is the character.
Yeah, how is that different than the, what do you believe is the subject of a claim?
The subject of a claim is, for instance, does Bigfoot exist?
Okay, first of all, that's a question. That's a question.
So presumably you mean, yeah, which is true.
There's a reason why we try to use propositional logic, because it keeps us from having to deal with two separate prongs at once, like God exists and God does not exist. You can address those independently. So proposition, some God exists. That's a proposition. The subject of that is God and existence. But when you were like, oh, there's the character of it separately, when you were describing character, you went into, this is something that somebody claims without good reason or evidence or motivation. I don't understand what that has to do. That has the reason why someone is convinced of something is fundamentally independent from what that thing is. So I can't see how that is either the subject or the character to say this is something that someone is claiming without evidence.
Well, that's good.
I mean, do you mean it's what?
I'm trying to understand what you're getting at, and I think we've kind of muddled several topics together. So maybe it would be good to kind of jump back to the beginning and either talk about your concern or the issue as distinctly as possible.
Yeah.
Okay, distinctly as possible. What I've tried to do was to take the supernatural and to make it the product of a human mind.
Do you mean you've tried to describe the ideas that generally people in a muddy kind of way associate with the supernatural and ascribe the cause of those things to things that occur in a human's mind rather than in reality?
Right.
Okay. So without a clear definition of what supernatural is, I'm going to proceed anyway, and we'll just, can we just pick a supernatural claim of someone gets messages from ghosts? We'll just use that one as an example. Would that be fair?
Sure.
Right?
Just to speak in specific language.
And you said what you're trying to do is to essentially assert that the cause of supernatural experiences is the human mind.
Right. I've taken the supernatural out of over and above reality, and I've moved it into reality.
Sure, I get that. How do you prove that you're right?
Okay.
Yeah.
I look at social construction.
Okay, but in order to show that you're right, you have to have a falsifiable claim. There has to be something that would show that you're wrong. And if, in fact, there is some supernatural realm or component, and somebody could provide evidence for that, then you would turn out to be wrong. So you would have to show that there isn't a supernatural realm. Not just that people can be, because how do you show the difference between somebody who thinks they heard a ghost and someone who actually heard a ghost? How do you tell the difference between those two?
How do I know the difference between
a person who actually hears a ghost and a person who only thinks they've heard a ghost?
I need evidence.
What kind of evidence would you look for in that case?
What I look for?
Well, would you look for to determine whether or not it was a person who heard a ghost or a person who thought they heard a ghost?
I would look to the one and not the other, I guess.
Well, what you said you were going to do, essentially you're going to take every supernatural claim and just say, nope, these are the product of human minds. Okay, so what you're really saying is there is no supernatural. And on that level, I don't know how you demonstrate that.
Yeah. Does that make sense, Angus?
I'm trying.
Okay, so let me see if I can take a different tact. What it sounds like is the idea that there are supernatural occurrence and events is something that you've thought about, and you have come to a conclusion that the likely cause of, in general, supernatural events is people being wrong about the causes of whatever the phenomenon is. For example, hearing a ghost. That is an interesting place to start, but if you're going to come to the conclusion that, you know, when Bob heard the ghost of Thomas Jefferson, it was in Bob's mind, like a specific phenomenon, you'd have to examine the evidence for that specific phenomenon, which is difficult because it's an event that occurred in the past.
It's not only that, but it's an event that occurred in someone's mind, whether there's a supernatural component or not. Well, this is actually something in my Magic and Skepticism show, which I'll be doing the morning of the Bat Cruise.
September 22nd.
September 22nd at what, like 10 in the morning or something. I demonstrate what could be construed as a ghost communicating with us. And then I ask the audience, you know, but we all know that's bullshit, right? And by and large, the audience will say yes. And then I have to say, no, you don't. You're in a position where you don't know what the explanation is for the event that you just witnessed. How do you demonstrate that I didn't actually summon a ghost here? It's essentially, in a practical sense, it's an unfalsifiable proposition. There's no way to show that that's not true. And so unless... Now, you can make the case, hey, I know you're a magic boy and you've got tricky stuff and you put this together in order to fool me, so there's a strong likelihood that this is more likely to be, you know, some kind of trick than it is an actual supernatural event, and I will agree with you. But if the point is, if you're wanting to take all supernatural claims or claims that people associate a supernatural cause with and just say, oh, that's all BS, we know that that's all in their mind, you've now adopted a burden of proof that I don't see any way you could meet. And for me, the better thing to do is to say, no one has successfully demonstrated supernatural causation. I have no idea how they can. And until they do, I'm never justified in accepting that there's a supernatural explanation. I'm open to them demonstrating it if they can, but until then, I can't accept that there's something supernatural. And doing that is not the same as saying, the supernatural isn't real, this is a fiction you've invented in your head. This is about where the burden of proof should rest and how to properly use skepticism, because skepticism is not about debunking, and it is not about saying, oh, all these things are false. That's far closer to cynicism. What skepticism is about is investigating claims with the intent of verifying whether they are real or not. There are occasions where you can show that somebody's engaged in fraudulent stuff, but by and large, and this is what's so discomforting, you're going to come out of a skeptical investigation of the paranormal with, well, we couldn't confirm that it was paranormal, but we also can't show that it's not. Yeah. So we're stuck right where we were at the beginning.
Is this similar to whether or not there's a God? If I say there is no God, I can't prove it.
Yeah. The existence of a God.
It depends on the God.
Well, that's very true, right? If someone claims that God is the...
If, for instance, there's no evidence for a God,
we'll say, just for clarity, we'll say like the God of classical theism, like an all-knowing, all-powerful being that exists in kind of the way that people would assume you mean God if you said so in the United States, just for simplicity.
And so for the record...
That is a supernatural claim.
But for the record, for that God, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence is something that Carl Sagan's famous for. Hang on. It's something Carl Sagan's famous for saying, and I think it's wrong. Because absence of evidence for a proposition, if there would be expected evidence, if that were true, is evidence for absence. It's not absolute confirmation. So the fact that we don't find evidence for a God doesn't prove that God doesn't exist, but it is evidence towards the conclusion that that God doesn't exist. It's just whether or not you can demonstrate that the God doesn't exist. So when there is an absence of evidence for a proposition where we would expect evidence, like, hey, Matt murdered somebody and threw the body in the trunk of his car, and then we go out and we, investigate the trunk of my car, and there's no body, and there's no blood, and there's no all these other things. All of the evidence that would be needed to convict me of this is missing. That is evidence for my innocence, but it's not confirmation of my innocence in the same way that evidence against the God propositions is not confirmation that the gods don't exist.
Yeah, and what I would say is people confuse what could effectively refer to as a void or an absence of a thing, and they kind of equivocate that to being there not being evidence, right? So if in your example, there is a specific room that the murder is supposed to have occurred in, and that room has one door, and that door has a security camera on it 24/7, and there is footage of an absence of Matt entering the room, the evidence of that absence is evidence that supports the proposition that Matt did not enter that room and viciously murder Bob with a hatchet. Not to get specific, but...
Sorry, Bob.
Yeah. If that helps at all. I mean, really, cycling back to what we're talking about, which is you concluding that no, supernatural things do not exist, rather than saying, I don't have a reason to believe that they exist. It seems like a nitpicky or semantic distinction, but it's not, and it's very important, because the former, well, no supernatural things exist, well, no black swans exist, is a temptation that is a kind of weakness that is natural in human reasoning, right? The temptation is, well, that sounds ridiculous to me, or even just, why would I think that that is true? Therefore, it's not, right? It's not a good application of skepticism. And one of the key elements that I would say is important if you're adopting a skeptical mindset and a skeptical approach to the world is to know that something that is your natural inclination, as far as you would like, oh, I'd come to a conclusion that this is true or that is false, doesn't mean that it's a good way of coming to a conclusion. So the temptation to say, well, I haven't seen any evidence that this is true, and people have been talking about various kinds of things like this for ages, and they haven't come up with good evidence, therefore it doesn't exist, is an unjustified conclusion.
And I'm going to muddy this up just slightly.
Yeah.
Because there's a difference between saying the supernatural isn't real, it's bullshit, and saying, I don't believe that there's anything supernatural, I haven't seen sufficient evidence. And there's also a difference between those two in saying, I am convinced that the supernatural isn't real. You're not making a positive assertion of absolute or that you have, absolute certainty or confidence, but I'm fine with the notion. I, for example, don't believe in God and I don't believe in anything supernatural, but I also believe that most of the gods that I've been presented with don't exist. That's a positive belief. I also believe that most of the supernatural claims, if not all of the supernatural claims I've heard, are in fact false, because I have evaluated the evidence for it, found it lacking. I've evaluated the evidence against it and found it reasonable. And we know enough about human nature and fallibility that I'm comfortable saying, not only do I not believe in the supernatural, but as far as I can tell, I'm convinced that the supernatural isn't real. However, I am open to them demonstrating that it's true because the burden of proof rests on them. Even if you're not convinced that the supernatural is false, the issue is, are you or are you not convinced it's true? Does that make sense?
It does make sense.
Yeah.
I hope so.
Sounds like I need to bone up.
Yeah, there's a lot of things you can do. One, the productions of the ACA, many of them revolve around this. Further details in the description below this video. But additionally, there's podcasts and books that you can listen to and watch respectively. And I would recommend The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe because it's interesting, entertaining, and they address things that happen, particularly in science, that highlight all of this. There's also a thing on the great courses that Dr. Stephen Novella did, the name of which I can't remember because evidently I don't remember the name of anything today, that is effectively Skepticism 101, and it talks about the flaws in reasoning. And he starts with highlighting that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the author and creator of the character Sherlock Holmes, was fooled by the Connolly
fairies. It's in my show.
Oh, okay.
A whole segment on Houdini and Conan Doyle is in my show.
Yeah, because they were friends, and then they split because Arthur Conan Doyle was taken in by, like, fairies exist.
It's worse than that, but that's all in the show.
Stay tuned until September 22nd.
Yeah, come down the show. I'll talk about Houdini and Conan Doyle.
Yeah, that's a lot of tuning in. But yeah, it takes a lot of work. And in this same way that when you begin to understand the way that a human's minds work, as far as we can determine them, it becomes a point where when you're addressing the claim that Matt murdered Bob with a hatchet, and you can look at the objective evidence that, well, here's a video camera on the door and it isn't opened, and then you can go, well, who's making the claim? It's a person, and why are they making the claim? And they say, well, I was falling asleep and it just made sense to me, but I can't remember my reasoning. You then have an explanation for the claim as well. And you can't conclude that, oh, well, they definitely didn't have any reason to believe it. Maybe they were just thinking about Matt's ability to do magic and at the time thought of a way that he could do it but have forgotten now. So you can't conclude definitely that Matt didn't murder Bob with a hatchet. But the evidence in this example would be, in my mind, sufficient to acquit.
Gosh, So now I have I now have something for my next book, even though the first one's not done, and that's questions you should ask yourself. Because
did you murder Bob?
On the moral thing, the question that I like to suggest everybody ask themselves is, if everybody else in the world took the action that I was about to take, would that make the world better or worse? But on the front of skepticism, the question to ask yourself is, am I getting ready to make a claim that I can't defend, and am I doing it in reaction to them not being able to defend their claim? Because if that's the case, you should shut up. Because if they've made a claim that they can't defend, that's where all of the focus needs to be. And what we end up doing, and this is reactionary, it's human and it's natural, is in much the same way that we're going to tell fish stories, or that preachers will tell you, I know that I know that I know that I know, we tend to exaggerate. And so when somebody says, I talked to my dead grandmother last night just before bed and she told me this, the correct thing is, all right, let's start asking questions. What was it like? How did you determine what the cause was, et cetera? If instead of doing that, we say, that's bullshit because the supernatural's not real, and then their response is going to be, prove it.
Yeah.
We're screwed. How do you prove that? At best, you're just saying, oh, I just don't believe it. And then they're going to do the Big Lebowski, well, that's just your opinion, bro. and now you haven't made any progress, and nobody's any closer to the truth.
Yeah.
So
you've matched their unsupported claim with an unsupported claim of your own.
Yeah, and go with Hitch. Claims that can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. There you go.
There you go.
So did that help you get to a place where you can think about...
It does help me.
Right.
Thank you, guys.
Well, cool. And certainly calling back in next week will be helpful as well. I know that Eric has a particular interest in skepticism as he explores it as well. So hope to talk to you again, Angus.